Listen and answer out loud. Which of these things would be in a fantasy story? Why or why not? Would an astronaut be in a fantasy story? No, an astronaut would not be in a fantasy story because astronauts are real people. Would a ballerina be in a fantasy story? No, a ballerina would not be in a fantasy story because a ballerina is also a real person. Would cowboys be in a fantasy story? No, a cowboy would not be in a fantasy story because cowboys are real people. Would a dragon be in a fantasy story? Yes, a dragon would be in a fantasy story because dragons are made up or pretend. Would an elf be in a fantasy story? Yes, an elf would be in a fantasy story because elves are made up or pretend. Would a fairy be in a fantasy story? Yes, a fairy would be in a fantasy story because fairies are made up or pretend. Would a giant be in a fantasy story? Yes, because giants are made up or pretend. Would a soldier be in a fantasy story? Yes, because soldiers are made up or pretend.